In its narrative, Beijing aims at highlighting the shared socialist path towards the Balkans, using this existence of some degree of post communist nostalgia in the region and focusing on traditional friendship and shared past.
On May 7, 1999, 5 bombs rained down from U.S. jets on the Chinese embassy in Belgrade as part of NATO's air campaign to halt the deadly assault by the forces of Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic on ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. Nearly a quarter of a century later, China is transforming the site of its bombed former embassy into an expansive cultural center said to be one of the largest of its kind in Europe. Once opened, the center will serve not only as a potent symbol of China's growing presence in the Western Balkans, but also the potential kinship between the two regions, not least owing to the shared socialist past that Chinese diplomats often emphasize to advance those relations. In the long run, some experts deem China's growing economic clout in Europe, primarily through the Western Balkans, a more consequential trend than Russia's invasion of Ukraine itself. To unpack just how deep China's influence on the region runs, we are joined this week by Damir Marusic of the Atlantic Council and Valbona Zeneli of the Marshall Center. Enjoy the episode.
So thank you so much for joining us today. Val, I want to start with you. If you could give us an overview of the history of Chinese relations with the Balkans region. Obviously, China is governed by the Chinese Communist Party and Yugoslavia was a communist state during the Cold War. How has that history shaped ties between the Balkans or the countries in the Balkans and China?
Well, thank you, Julian. I'm so glad to be part of this podcast. Thank you for having me. That's a great question. The Balkans have seen a significant expansion of Chinese influence over the last decade, and that is in line with Beijing's geoeconomic and diplomatic vision of the Belt and Road Initiative, but also in the broader context of China-European Union relations. As you rightly point out, China is not a newcomer in the Balkans. Diplomatic, economic, cultural ties with Beijing have existed for decades for Albania, but also the countries of the former Yugoslavia. But I'll say that activities in recent years have shown that China is really laying the groundwork for a long-term and ever deeper presence in the region. And in its narrative, Beijing aims at highlighting the shared socialist path towards the Balkans, using this existence of some degree of post communist nostalgia in the region and focusing on traditional friendship and shared past. These are the common words that they use also in their narrative in the region. I'll start with Albania. Diplomatic relations between China and Albania have officially started back in 1949, and they grew even stronger based on the shared communist ideology. And then the split of communist Albania from the Soviet Union in the early 60s that opened the way for a stronger and more exclusive relationship with China. Strong economic and cultural links were developed during those 2 decades until this relationship fell apart in 1978 due to ideological disputes. That was the reason, because China was opening up to the market economy. And as you know, Albania then isolated further itself from the rest of the world until 1991. When we talk about the Sino-Yugoslav relations, they were good during the 60s and the 70s, but they became even closer after the breakup between Beijing and Tirana. So we have very important visits in the late 70s, both Chinese Prime Minister visiting Belgrade and former President Tito visiting China for the first times. Then ties were strengthened in the mid 90s when the isolated, former President Slobodan Milosevic found an ally to faraway China, and that opened the door actually also for the first Chinese migrants in Serbia. Serbia today is the country in the Balkans, but I'll say also in Europe, if you consider per capita, that has the largest number of Chinese migrants. China is considered strategic partner for Serbia, which has also become the main beneficiary of Chinese investments in southeastern Europe. And then since 2012, the five Western Balkan countries, excluding Kosovo, which is not recognized from China, have been all part of the 16 plus 1 initiative with Central and Eastern European countries, and also are all of these countries are official members of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Look, I think Val captured most of it. I think the important thing to keep in mind when thinking about Chinese influence in the region, it has a lot to do with the fact that apart from all of the historical elements and the appeals to a shared past that Val lines up, is that you have just not terribly well institutionalized and not deeply reformed societies, which operate on the principle of the big man, basically some kind of strong man that has for centuries intermediated between greater outside powers in the local community, and basically has been able to bring the goods to it. It's basically a form of corruption, but it's also just the mode and under which politics have operated. And if you look at history going back, to Ottoman times, past that to Yugoslav times, to independence today, you've always had this sort of dimension to local political economy of powerful leaders, almost always men, who get resources from outside and then distribute to the community and keep a lion's share to themselves. I think that's the other really, I think, good way beyond geopolitics to sort of understand China's influence and China's game in the region. It is one of exploiting this dynamic. It's also, should hasten to add, is not a dynamic that's exclusive to the Balkans. It's how corruption works in many parts outside of the core West. And when you see basically Chinese influence and Chinese work in the region, it has as much to do as anything about enriching local elites. There are all sorts of deals that are non-transparent, and then oftentimes, I think most loudly in the case of Serbia, you are seeing the local leaders actually try and make political hay out of the fact that they have a friend in China. But that's less prevalent in the rest of the region, I think. And I think the dynamic of basically double dealing and basically corrupt or at least non-transparent tenders and business dealings is what really forms the core of the relationship.
So when we think about Chinese foreign policy initiatives, the Belt and Road Initiative is the one that looms largest. Val, is the recent engagement by China in the region, is it purely commercial, or are we seeing broader areas of cooperation?
Well, that's a great question. I'd like to follow up. I totally agree with Damir on some reasoning why China is interested in the Western Balkans. I agree with Damir that political elites in the region, more specifically in Serbia, but also in the other countries, see the presence of China as purely economic and beneficial, and mostly opportunistic. That meaning that Chinese projects are easily aligned with political cycles and also coupled down with top-down rather than transparent and market-driven procurement decisions, meaning enriching some of the elites. So Beijing's offers allow decision makers in the region to fuel patronage networks and also boost short-term electoral advantages. So just to follow up on the first question, when it comes to this balance between commercial and political interest, I think we should not lose sight that Chinese interest in the Balkans should be seen in the context of Beijing's overall strategy in Europe. I think it's the geostrategic position of the Western Balkans that's a perfect bridgehead to European Union markets, and it's a key transit corridor for the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So Chinese interests in the Balkans are strongly related to infrastructure projects or related to privatization opportunities, where we know that demand for preferential lending is high and acquisition prices are much lower than the other European countries. But also Beijing is searching for new markets to export and expand its exports. It's searching for strategic assets in the front yard of the EU, but also Chinese companies, as we're noticing in some of the countries, are securing access to natural resources and focusing on strategic sectors such as energy, mining, and mineral processing. So my point is that the Balkans is a region that's geostrategically very important because of the proximity that it has with the European Union market. And so if we take all the markets of the Western Balkans, it's all 6 countries, so also including Kosovo, it's less than 18 million consumers. It's a GDP around $130 billion in 2021, and that makes up less than 1% of the European Union market. So it's important to look also at numbers and how significant economically is the Western Balkans for China. I think it's more significant, as I mentioned, for the proximity with the European Union. So it has geopolitical and economic interest in the region. So considering the very small market, it's not that important for China. However, we have seen that trade exchanges have increased, and China has become the second or the third largest trading partner for the region, mainly import partner. Trade has increased about 3 times since 2012, when the countries joined the 16 plus 1 initiative, going from almost $3 billion to $8 billion. But also in terms of European comparisons, Chinese trade with the Western Balkans makes up only 1% of the Chinese trade with the European Union, so not very important. But the actual trade balance is very heavily tilted in favor of China, meaning that we have mainly Chinese imports in the region rather than exports from the Western Balkans in the Chinese market. That means that trade deficits towards China have risen tremendously for the region. This is when it comes to trade. When it comes to investment, we have seen a much rapid Chinese expansion in investment. There's been a study recently from Bern showing that there are around 120 projects with an estimated value of a little bit more than $30 billion. Now, this might not be significant for China, but this is significant for the Western Balkans. Because if you take all investment in the Western Balkans, which is around $85 billion, means that it makes up 40% of the total foreign direct investment. But the trick there is that this money is not FDI, it's not foreign direct investment, it's not actual foreign direct investment, it's mostly loans. And actually, this is the main form of economic cooperation in the region, concessional lending for infrastructure, mainly in transport and energy. And it's done through the state-owned banks, through the Chinese financial vehicles, but also through Chinese companies, and in most of the cases, also Chinese labor force.
Damir, before you jump in on that, I just want to ask as well. We're seeing a reaction to these Chinese loans as part of the Belt and Road Initiative and the fear over debt traps and an emerging backlash from populations that in countries that are suffering from a high debt burden. Damir, are we seeing the same reaction in the Balkans, and how is that affecting its position with Europe and with China?
Well, look, I mean, how do I put it? I don't think you're seeing that much of a backlash, quite frankly, on the ground against Chinese investment because, I hate to say it, but the civil society in the region is dispirited. It's somewhat quiescent. I mean, it's a sign of yet another manifestation of corruption and sort of self-dealing that happens among elites. But the Chinese aspect of it, in and of itself, I don't think it's that pronounced in the region. Look, just to build on what Val said there in her answer, and just to sort of underline it again, I think that anyone thinking about Chinese influence in the Western Balkans, anyone in the West thinking about it, needs to see it as part of a bigger play for the European market. Um, we as people that work on the Western Balkans, we can slice and dice what's happening in these countries and give detailed pictures, but none of these things make any sense outside of a bigger play for the region. I hasten to add then that while political influence and such things obviously is of some importance to China, and perhaps they hope to count on it when the chips are down. Perhaps if there is escalation over Taiwan and things get heated in international fora, perhaps they're counting on political influence in the Western Balkans, helping them out in, I don't know, votes in the UN or something like that. But honestly, it really is. It just needs to be understood as a bigger play for access to European markets. And in that sense, while it is important, I think to look at it in that lens and understand basically the play by the Chinese for the Balkans as a part of the broader story about European enlargement into the region, the imperatives for it to do so, for basically to integrate the Western Balkans onto basically European standards and the broader European economy. It's and basically contextualizing China in that sense, it doesn't make too much sense, I think, to think about what China's play in any of the individual countries is. Keep focus on the bigger picture on this, which again is the bigger geostrategic play. The Balkans by themselves are not a geostrategic play alone.
So you've brought up an interesting point that actually I want to turn over to Val. I realize I've been using the phrase the Balkans or the Western Balkans, and it's a bit like saying the Middle East or the Gulf. Obviously, there are many countries within it. Are there certain countries in which the relationship is deepest? And how does the sort of the history of the Balkans, and particularly its sort of vociferous history, affect its relationship, or these particular countries' relationship with China compared to the EU? Val, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, that's it's an interesting question. So, following up on what Damir said, I think in the region when it comes to public perception also on China, you mentioned if there is negative reaction on the expensive Chinese infrastructure projects and the debt trap possibilities. I think it's the political behavior in the region that shapes public perception too. I'll say that few in the Western Balkans really have an opinion on the domestic situation in China, and the geographical, distance plays in Beijing's favor. But also when it comes to the 16 plus 1 initiative that became, 17 plus 1 and then back to 16 plus 1, it may become 14 plus 1 soon, or the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't think there is much, knowledge in the region. And I think it's this also Beijing's narrative and that that brings itself as a partner to bring wealth in the Western Balkans and uses the economic carrots and the levers also for public relations and strategic messaging to influence the public opinion in the region. I believe that Beijing is taking an opportunistic approach in the region. Of course, needs to be seen, as Damir said, in the broader context of the Beijing's overall strategy in Europe. But here we see a hybrid approach. You mentioned a couple of times the Belt and Road Initiative. I think in the Balkans we see a combination of elements of infrastructure projects that we see in developing countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, such as in Africa, but also economic interactions with the EU countries, such as in the framework of the 16 plus 1. Because, also the 16 plus 1 is a strange beast. You have like 11 countries that are members of the European Union, and you have the Western Balkan countries that are in the process of being integrated in the European Union. So I think Beijing is really cultivating this image of itself as being a benign, a global player and trying to present itself as a credible source of economic development, but also as a reliable partner looking for opportunities to invest in strategically important sectors. And so, it's not just the economic influence. We have seen, with the aim of building a community of friendly countries, Beijing has been investing very heavily in cultural diplomacy, from the Confucius Institutes that are present in every country, in every capital, to chambers of commerce, to cultural centers. But also in recent years, we have seen a marked rise in China's media presence across the Western Balkans. We're seeing that it's paying greater attention to culture in the media content, that to generate to promote China. And I think the objective is to gain this broader public profile to promote Chinese economic and political model and shape positive narratives about China, or at least avoiding negative news stories on China. And we have seen that across the region. So there's no talk in the media about Chinese suppression on Uyghur Muslims. In general, topics such as Hong Kong or Taiwan are treated in a neutral way, or in many cases using Chinese sources. And as Damir said, I think it's the presence of a very weak civil society, but also the oligarchic influence over the media, which is very weak in the Western Balkans, that provide more opportunities for China to present itself as this benign global power.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, turning to the next question, and we'll start with Damir, and then we'll turn back to Val. One of the lines of argument, Damir, that governments in other parts of Europe, say Central Europe, have offered when they're asked to justify why they accept Chinese development aid or infrastructure finances is not so much the attractiveness of that money in itself, but rather that compared with similar lines of financing from Western institutions like the EU or the IMF, the Chinese money comes with less strings attached. And so, just to ask my question quite directly, how much of China's involvement in the region, financial involvement, is a rejection of Europe, and what initiatives has the EU taken recently to correct this sort of drift away from the old continent and toward China?
Well, look, my colleagues at SIPE, where I wrote a report for them about Chinese investment and influence in the region, I guess about a year and a half ago at this point, they have a term for basically this Chinese capital. They don't just apply to the Balkans, but it applies very much to the Balkans and also Central Eastern Europe. They call it corrosive capital because it comes with no strings attached, and because in doing so it undermines efforts at more sort of longstanding reforms to rule of law and standards that are in fact necessary for countries to basically join and be full, good, and active members of the European Union. Now, for countries within the European Union already, that presents one set of challenges for the EU itself and for core EU members. That is to say, the undermining of existing standards that have been hard fought in the 1990s. That as these countries basically acceded to the full union. In the Western Balkans, the problem is that the countries still outside. It's no longer fashionable, I guess, to call Croatia and Slovenia Balkan countries. They're Adriatic countries now that they're in the EU. But the six that are still outside and are still hoping to get in. The main problem with corrosive capital is that it stunts the efforts for reform. So we were talking about the weakness of civil society, the general sort of apathy in the region, the lack of interest, the oligarchic media that doesn't ask the kind of questions that are required. All this makes basically the entrenched rulers of all the countries basically they can get away with more. And China plays a great role for that, that it allows them, it gives them a source of capital. Some of that gets redistributed through largesse and, basically as this enters the sort of political machine. But largely it's also skimmed off the top. And it allows them to sort of entrench themselves more. Let me just say one more thing about this, and it's about the question of the EU itself and the perception of the EU within the region, and how that's shaping up. Maybe more directly answering your question. It's striking the extent to which it's in Serbia more than anywhere else that this idea of the leadership of President Alexander Vucic, he's taken on this mantle of call it Titoism, of non-alignment, which I still think, well, clearly still has appeals to his electorate. I think Serbia is a special case because of the wars of the 1990s. There's a lot of resentment among the populace that they feel like they've been created a pariah out of, that they don't actually have friends in the West, and that their future may not be in the EU. And so the sort of non-aligned act that President Vucic plays, balancing Serbia between not just China and the European Union, but also Russia and the European Union, is very appealing. And so you see, unlike in other countries where I think you get a lot of this sort of Chinese influence flying more below the radar, in Serbia, it's actually a political tool. So when, during COVID, there were placards all over Belgrade thanking Brother Xi for his assistance in providing first aid care. And again, this was a huge own goal by the European Union, that the Western Balkans actually was not taken care of by the West, that both Russia and China played a big role. And within the Western Balkans, President Vucic played a masterful game, quite frankly, capitalizing on the fact that he was able to get stuff from the EU, but also from China and Russia for the betterment of his people, for his country, but also spreading that largesse further around the region. Just to give you a very quick anecdote, I was really struck. I was in Sarajevo about a year ago. I was meeting a friend of mine who works in one of the sort of civic parties in Bosnia, and very broadly liberal, very pro-European. She said, and Bosniak, I'd say, so Bosnian Muslim, and she said that her mother, who lived through the war and all the horrors of the war in Bosnia, she herself was warming to Vucic because what he had been able to pull off during the COVID crisis. So, it's to begin to answer the question, we can get into more of the details. What is the European Union doing about this? This is what I was getting at in my earlier answers. I think it's really important to understand that what we're talking about when we're talking about Chinese influence in the region, we really are talking about where does the region end up in the medium to long term? Does it end up firmly in the West, or does it remain this kind of nebulous border region that is contested and infinitely contestable by disruptor powers, whether they be in the Gulf, whether they be China, whether they be Russia, wherever Russia ends up in the medium term. And that's the question before everyone. There have been signs that the European Union is taking the region more seriously, and like I said, happy to talk about that more. But those are the stakes with what's happening right now.
Wonderful. And we are going to return to some of the implications of this for sort of internally within the EU. But I want to turn to Val here and sort of extend the prior question. I think one of the very interesting points of Damir's answer is that the rationale that is deployed by governments are pretty similar both in the Western Balkans and in countries that have more recently entered the EU. When you look at a country like Hungary, for instance, the government of Prime Minister Orban is also explaining that it wants to balance East and West. It wants to be a sort of a between straddling both areas of influence. And my question would be, what is the accession of countries in the Western Balkans into the EU? How is that going to change the balance of power in matters relating to China within the EU? When we've seen that countries such as Hungary have repeatedly blocked resolutions and statements condemning China's treatment of the Uyghurs or condemning China's treatment of Hong Kong. how is the countries that are currently on the path to accession to the EU? How would their future membership affect that balance in the matter of China? Val.
Hi there, this is not Val, this is Francois from the editing board right now. If you want to listen to Val's brilliant answer on China, the EU and the Balkans, really recommend you join us on Patreon, where the entire conversation, the full-length conversation will be, and you'll get plenty of excellent goodies down the road as well. So please consider joining us on Patreon. We'd very much appreciate it. Now, back to Julian and Jorge.
Thank you so much, Val and Damir, for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion on the Balkans. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too. Thank you both for joining us, and we hope to speak to you soon, hopefully about maybe more positive developments from Europe's relationship with the Western Balkans. So, Val and Damir are both out. It's just myself and Jorge now. And I got to say, that was one of my favorite conversations that we've done. I just learned so much listening to both of them talk about this region that probably doesn't get enough coverage, I think, when we think about Europe and its periphery. But Jorge, what were your thoughts coming out of that episode?
Yes, I think the crux or the fulcrum of the episode, or at least the most interesting part, in my view, in terms of the choices that are up for the EU to make in terms of the accession processes for some of these Western Balkan nations. I think the most interesting point was perhaps when Damir said, well, look, we cannot expect these Western Balkans nations that have just emerged from the yoke of communism, that are sort of younger, less mature democracies. We can't expect them, whether they accede into the EU or not. We cannot expect them to become Denmark overnight, right? But given that they are going to remain imperfect democracies, Damir said, I would rather have them inside the EU because that gives me some, at least some visibility, and it even gives me some influence over the rule of law and the division of powers and things of that nature in those countries. And I think this really called to mind what I think scholars call the Copenhagen paradox, which is a reference to the Copenhagen criteria, which are the list of criteria that the EU assesses when a country submits an application to become an EU member state, such as is the case currently of, say, Serbia, for instance, which isn't the Western Balkans per se. I think, in my understanding, the region sort of starts with Bosnia, but Serbia also is currently applying. And again, the conundrum for the EU is whether we can exercise a larger influence on those countries whilst they remain outside or once they are allowed in. And I think the record of countries that have recently been accepted, the example of Hungary was given, which again gave Damir the reference when he said, I'd rather have sort of several mini Orbans within the EU rather than being a pesky neighbor outside. And I think the example of Hungary is relevant because it is really a country that is just really a thorn on the side of the Franco-German axis. It really is sort of upsetting EU leaders and the European Parliament, and so much so that people are now. Hungary has currently an infringement procedure by the European Commission, which is potentially can pare back money from the EU COVID recovery fund from Hungary over rule of law problems, and that can very well be the case of the next Western Balkan nation that gets into the EU. So I think to me the most important element of this conversation was, what do we do as a bloc? Do we accept these countries with their deficiencies, or do we sort of impose a stringent standard that no country will be allowed to get in unless they meet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sort of goes to the heart of, is the European Union a realist strategic organization that promotes commercial rights, political rights, and human rights, or is it an idealists organization? And I think that tension of whether to stick to its principles in terms of the rule of law, in terms of anti-corruption measures, has in some ways hindered its ability to be active in its near abroad. We did an episode the other week on Russia's near abroad and declining influence because of perceived lack of power. Well, in some ways, Europe has been, asleep at the wheel and not paying attention to the way other powers are coming in and establishing ties in its near region. And we talked about this in our episode on Turkey, and again today in talking about Chinese involvement in the Western Balkans. So it really goes to the heart of the central questions facing the European Union in this new strategic environment that we're existing in.
Yes, absolutely. And my question to you, Julian, would be the following. Again, the question that I try to put to Damir, and I hope I was clear enough, was, look, the line of argument that Hungary gives whenever the EU sort of starts raising the issue of China's influence in Hungary, it says, China gives us money, it gives us universities, it gives us development money, infrastructure money, and it doesn't ask much in return in terms of the standards of rule of law, democracy that we have to. I mean, obviously, China being an autocracy, it's not interested in spreading liberal democracy in the world. Actually, quite the opposite. But it really seemed to me from Damir's examples that the Western Balkans are in a very similar position where they're having to. They've got two options. Either they take money from the Western-backed, well, actually, in reality, they take from both. But on one hand, they have the Western multilateral fora like the IMF and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the World Bank, maybe even some of the development institutions, which demand from them sort of really high standards in terms of how that money is spent. Or they take China's money, which has less strings attached. Although Val seemed to suggest that actually it has more strings attached than we think. What are your thoughts there?
So I think Damir raised an interesting point on this very particular issue that you're asking about, which is that it's not only a case of the strings attached, but for the elites in some of these countries, they are able to benefit financially from from what Damir and what you've said classifying as the absence of strings from Chinese loans. Although there are other riders on Chinese investment that these countries need to acquiesce to in order to accept money from China. But at the main point of investment, at the initial contact, elites in these countries are able to benefit enormously through additional wealth and by hoarding some of the monetary value that comes from these contracts, which just isn't applicable when you're borrowing money from, say, a European investment bank or from European capital markets, where you have to go through the rigorous contracting standards of the European Union. Now, I don't think it's quite fair to frame it as a dichotomy of, well, you either take the Chinese money with no strings attached, or you take the European Union with all its runners and riders. I think there is a way for Europe to invest in these countries in ways that are less exploitative, arguably more efficient. If you look at other global projects that China has financed, they're not always done in the most efficient way in terms of care for the local environment, respect for local communities, and also in terms of sustainability from an infrastructure perspective. I think Europe has an in there that it just needs to talk about more and find more creative ways of working around some of the intransigence that they're seeing in the Balkans, who are just sort of taking what seems like free money on offer from the Chinese. But I don't think it's quite a dichotomy. I understand Europe's reluctance to offer, sort of cash without any concessions. But I think there are ways of combining the depth of European private markets with its government controls to help finance some of these necessary infrastructure projects in ways that China can't, simply because we've seen failures in Chinese infrastructure in other places around the world.
Yeah. Wonderful nuance there. Very, very important.
Well, I think that's all from us this week on the Balkans. We'll be back with another episode next week. There's a lot of exciting developments happening on the continent. I encourage you again to like and subscribe, and importantly, share this episode and indeed all of our episodes on Uncommon Decency on whatever social media platforms you're on, including Twitter, if it's still around by the time this gets published. Jorge, thank you so much for joining me this week.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks a lot for being here and for your work on some of those questions, and we'll look forward to another episode next week.
And thank you again to our patrons. I don't have time, I'm afraid, to give you all named shout outs this week, but you help make this podcast run and help us keep us on the ground and running out every single week. So thank you to everyone, and hopefully you'll have a wonderful week. Take care.